On a frozen morning outside the French town of Bergeltroff, the 19th of November in 1944, a German anti-tank gunner named Schmidt squinted through his optical sight at the advancing column of American Sherman tanks. 3 days had passed since his unit first engaged with these particular tankers, and with each passing hour, everything his instructors at the racial training schools had drilled into him seemed increasingly like lies. The lead Sherman, trailing black smoke from previous hits and visibly damaged, kept pushing forward despite taking round after round. Through the magnification of his gun sight, Schmidt could see the tank commander clearly. A black man standing exposed in the turret, firing the .50 caliber machine gun mounted there with complete disregard for his own safety. The man Schmidt watched through his optics was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, though the German soldier wouldn't learn that name until historians pieced together this battle decades later. What Schmidt didn't know, what he couldn't have known from his position, was that Rivers had been severely wounded days earlier, his leg slashed to the bone by shrapnel. The staff sergeant had refused morphine injections because he needed to stay alert, declined evacuation orders, commandeered another tank when his first was disabled, and had been fighting with a gangrenous wound for 3 full days. Schmidt watched those final moments before Rivers' tank exploded under German fire with something approaching disbelief. The violence itself didn't shock him after 5 years of war. What haunted him for the rest of his life was the realization that everything he'd been taught about racial superiority had just been proven catastrophically wrong by the men his leaders had called inferior. The entry of the 761st Tank Battalion into the European War meant more than just another American unit joining the fight against Germany. It represented a collision between 2 fundamentally opposed worldviews, between Nazi racial theory and its complete refutation demonstrated through combat effectiveness. These tankers adopted the motto, "Come out fighting," and from their first engagement at the small Belgian town of Morville-le-Vicq in November 1944 through to the war's end, that's exactly what they did. But their fight carried a double meaning that German forces would come to understand in the most direct way possible through the sights of their anti-tank guns and from the floors of prisoner-of-war cages. The Wehrmacht units preparing to face the 761st included soldiers who had received racial indoctrination from childhood. German military training materials stated explicitly that black soldiers couldn't operate complex machinery, possessed no real courage, and would break and run at the first hint of combat. These weren't casual prejudices tossed around in barracks conversations, but fundamental beliefs woven into German military doctrine and operational planning. The 761st would spend 183 consecutive days in combat, proving every single one of these assumptions wrong in the most definitive way possible. The battalion's official constitution came on March 15, 1942, with activation following on April 1 at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. The activation didn't stem from any progressive thinking within the War Department, but from what internal documents called political necessity to maintain Negro morale. The path these men followed to combat differed completely from white units. The 761st trained for nearly 2 years while watching white armoured battalions deploy overseas after 12 to 16 weeks of preparation. The men knew why. They understood that any mistake, any failure, wouldn't be attributed to them as individuals, but to their entire race. So they trained, and trained, and trained some more. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates commanded the battalion, a white officer whose career was considered finished the moment he accepted the position. Bates had served in the previous war and watched French colonial troops fight with distinction. More importantly, he judged men by what they could do rather than the colour they happened to be. After 2 years of training, Bates assessed the 761st as the best-trained tank battalion in the entire United States Army. Among the men who would prove him right stood Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers from Hotulka, Oklahoma, a man standing 6 feet 2 inches who had grown up working a farm and possessed what Bates called an intuitive understanding of terrain and tactics. Warren Creasy earned the nickname Iron Man for his extraordinary combat endurance. And there was the battalion's most famous member who would never see combat, First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, an athlete who would become one of baseball's greatest players. Robinson lost his chance at combat when he refused to move to the back of a segregated military bus at Fort Hood, Texas, in July 1944. After 2 years of training in Texas, the 761 received deployment orders on June 9, 1944, 3 days after the Normandy landings. They crossed the Atlantic aboard the British trooper Esperance Bay, reaching England on September 8, 1944. After a brief stay in England, the battalion landed in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. They were immediately attached to General George Patton's Third Army. Patton's skepticism about black tankers was well documented in his letters home, where he'd written doubts about whether they could think fast enough for armoured warfare. Yet on October 28, 1944, Patton stood before the assembled battalion and delivered a speech that became famous. He told them they were the first Negro tankers to fight in the American Army, that he would never have asked for them if they weren't good because he had nothing but the best in his army. He said he didn't care what colour they were as long as they went up there and killed those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone had their eyes on them, he said, expecting great things. The Black Panthers got their chance on November 7, 1944, attacking the German-held town of Morville-le-Vicq in support of the 26th Infantry Division. The German defenders, a mixture of Wehrmacht infantry and anti-tank units, expected an easy victory against what they'd been told were America's inferior troops. The battle lasted 4 hours. Inside the town, the lead tank, commanded by a sergeant named King, was knocked out by a German Panzerfaust. 2 crew members were wounded. Their comrades dragged them to safety behind the burning tank and then killed the soldier who'd fired the Panzerfaust. German after-action reports, discovered years later in military archives, noted with surprise the exceptional tactical proficiency displayed by the attacking tank unit. They'd expected panic when the first tank was hit. Instead, they faced a coordinated assault that systematically eliminated their positions. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers encountered a German roadblock that stopped his tank's advance. Under heavy small arms fire, Rivers dismounted, attached a cable from his Sherman to the roadblock, climbed back into his tank, and had his crew pull the obstacle off the road, freeing the entire column to resume the advance and capture the town. Rivers received the Silver Star for this action, the first of many decorations the battalion would earn. November 1944 saw the 761st in constant combat. They endured what would become 183 days of continuous operational employment. The battalion suffered 156 casualties in November alone. 24 men killed, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The unit also lost 14 tanks evacuated and another 20 damaged in combat. These dry numbers don't capture what German forces were learning. The black tankers they'd been told would flee at first contact were instead maintaining an operational tempo that exceeded most white American units. While typical tank battalions rotated to the rear after 10 to 14 days of combat, the 761 stayed on the front lines continuously. German intelligence reports from this period, housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, begin showing confusion about the identity of these tankers. One report from the 11th Panzer Division notes that an enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displays exceptional maintenance of vehicles and aggressive tactics inconsistent with intelligence assessments. The most dramatic demonstration of the battalion's determination came during the assault on Gebling. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward Gebling, France, Rivers' tank hit a mine at a railroad crossing. The explosion severely wounded him, slashing his leg to the bone. Rivers declined morphine injections, refused evacuation, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gebling the next day. Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, repeatedly ordered him to evacuate. Rivers' response, documented in Williams's report, was simple. "Captain, you know better than that," he said. "This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic inspecting Rivers' swollen and infected leg looked up shouting that he had gangrene, but Williams only had time to say Reuben's name before German guns zeroed in, forcing the Americans to take cover. On November 19, 1944, the end came for Staff Sergeant Rivers. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Bergaltroff, their next objective, but were stopped by enemy fire. Captain Williams ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover. Rivers, however, radioed that he had spotted the German anti-tank positions. "I see them," he transmitted. "I see them. We'll fight them." Joined by another Company A tank, Rivers opened fire on enemy positions, covering Company A as they withdrew. While doing so, his tank was hit, killing him and wounding the rest of his crew. Williams immediately recommended Rivers for the Medal of Honor, though it would take 52 years for that recommendation to be acted upon. December 16, 1944, brought the Wehrmacht's last major offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division and thrown into the desperate fight to stop the German breakthrough. The battalion faced some of Germany's best remaining units, including elements of the Führerbegleit Brigade, an elite formation expanded from the personal escort battalion of the German leader. The fighting around Tillet, Belgium was particularly brutal. Replacements were hard to come by, and many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained, or being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. Despite receiving inadequate replacements, the 761st continued fighting. The battalion's Shermans and the 87th Division Infantry had to struggle against bitter resistance every step of the way. The German forces included Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans, at ranges where millimeter guns couldn't penetrate the Tiger's armor. Yet the 761st developed tactics to compensate. They used their superior mobility to flank the heavier German tanks and their mechanical reliability to maintain more vehicles in action. One tanker, Sergeant Frank Cochran, shouted over the radio that they'd hit him 3 times, but he was still giving them hell. By January 9th, 1945, Tillet was in American hands. The 761st had helped stop the German offensive, but at a heavy cost. February and March 1945 saw the 761st participating in the assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's last major fortification system. The battalion was attached to the 103rd Infantry Division for the assault. Within a few days, the Siegfried Line was broken, and enemy troops came forward to surrender in increasingly large numbers. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted 4,000 casualties, and captured nearly as many prisoners. The combat here differed from France and Belgium. Now they were on German soil, facing increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units defending their homeland. Yet German soldiers were also beginning to surrender in larger numbers, particularly when they realized they were facing the black tankers they'd heard about. Prisoners were terrified to be captured by black soldiers, believing thanks to their own propaganda that they could expect no mercy from such savages. The men of the 761st learned not to rise out of their tank hatches until the Germans came close, lest the surrendering troops see their black skins, howl in terror, and run away. This fear, based entirely on Nazi propaganda about black soldiers being savage and merciless, proved completely unfounded. The 761st treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols, often sharing their own rations with captured Germans. As the battalion crossed into Germany proper in March 1945, they encountered scenes that revealed the true nature of the regime they were fighting. German civilians, conditioned by years of racial propaganda, were terrified of the black soldiers. Many fled rather than remain in areas occupied by the 761st. Yet the battalion maintained strict discipline. There were no reprisals against civilians, no looting, no revenge attacks, despite the racial hatred they knew these people had been taught. This professional conduct confused German civilians who had expected the racial inferiors to behave like the savages depicted in Nazi propaganda. The tank battles continued as the 761 pushed deeper into Germany. They faced Panthers, Tigers, and the desperate resistance of SS units. Warren Creasy, who had earned his Iron Man nickname, was particularly notable during this period. He would often dismount his tank at night with an M1 Garand rifle to conduct personal reconnaissance missions. One of the most profound moments in the 761st's combat history came in early May 1945. On May 2nd, the tankers liberated Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, discovering some 15,000 Hungarian Jews near death from starvation. The scene that greeted the black tankers defied description. Thousands of skeletal figures, many unable to stand, filled the camp. The SS guards had fled days earlier, leaving the prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled seeing people who looked like skeletons trying to smile, trying to wave. Some of them were crying. The tankers gave them everything they had, their rations, their chocolate, everything. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were liberating the victims of racial hatred. One woman liberated by the unit, 17-year-old Sonia Schreiber-Weitz, described the soldier who saved her in a poem called The Black Messiah. "A black G I stood by the door," she wrote. "I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die," I thought. He must be the Messiah. By the end of April 1945, the 761 would be one of the first US battalions to meet up with Soviet forces. The meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945. Sources vary between April 26th and May 5th to 6th. Tanker. Leonard Smith received the shock of his life when a stout Russian woman tanker approached him shouting, "America, America, America," and swathed him in a tight hug until he could hardly breathe. The Soviet forces, including female tank crews, showed no surprise at seeing black American tankers. For them, what mattered was that these were fellow soldiers who had survived the brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion's combat record speaks for itself. 183 consecutive days of combat from November 7, 1944 to May 6, 1945. 6 countries traversed, including France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany and Austria. 4 major campaigns covering northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace and Central Europe. Approximately 4,000 German casualties inflicted per National World War II museum records. Hundreds of vehicles destroyed, 31 pillboxes eliminated, 49 machine gun emplacements taken out, 29 anti-tank guns captured. Unit casualties approached 50% of initial strength. The battalion started with 36 officers, 30 black and 6 white, plus 676 enlisted men. They lost 71 tanks total. Awards included 1 Medal of Honor posthumously to Reuben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, and approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts. While specific Wehrmacht documents mentioning the 761st by designation are limited, German reactions to Black American troops are well documented in military archives and prisoner interrogations. One surrendering German officer asked how many Negro Panzer divisions there were. When told there was only one battalion, he refused to believe it. The continuous presence of the 761st over 183 days had created the impression of a much larger force. German prisoners repeatedly expressed surprise at the combat effectiveness of black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now housed in the US National Archives, show German soldiers struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they had been taught about racial superiority. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told interrogators that they were told the Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when we knocked out their tanks, he said. This was not what we expected. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the 761st's fight was far from over. Like their white comrades, African-American tankers struggled with memories and, in some cases, post-traumatic stress. Unlike white soldiers, however, black soldiers dealt with segregation and the often savage racial prejudice characteristic of this period in American history. Texas Native Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr. described the contradictions for black soldiers coming back to the United States in an oral history, saying they didn't have equal rights and democracy was against them. The men who had destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they couldn't eat in many restaurants, had to sit in the back of buses, and faced violent racism. German prisoners of war held in the United States were often treated better than the black soldiers who had captured them. For 33 years, the 761st Tank Battalion's achievements went officially unrecognized at the unit level. Individual medals were awarded, but the Presidential Unit citation that white battalions received immediately was denied. It wasn't until January 24, 1978, that President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit citation to the 761. The citation read in part that the 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous operations. The ultimate recognition came in 1997, when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor. Not until over 50 years later, on January 12, 1997, was the Medal of Honor finally bestowed on Platoon Sergeant Reuben Rivers. President Clinton noted at the ceremony that no African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it at the time. One of the most interesting transformations involved General Patton himself. Despite his initial skepticism about black soldiers, Patton's assessment of the 761 Saint changed dramatically through their service. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German soldiers who had raided American warehouses were reported to have disguised themselves as Americans guarding checkpoints in order to ambush American soldiers, Patton solved this problem by ordering black soldiers, including the 761st, to guard the checkpoints and gave the order to shoot any white soldiers at the checkpoints who acted suspiciously. This order demonstrated remarkable trust. Patton was literally placing the security of his entire army in the hands of black soldiers he had once doubted could think fast enough for armored warfare. By the end of the war, Patton had recommended the 761 Saint for numerous commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and problematic, his military assessment of the battalion was unequivocal. They were among his best units. Ironically, the racism that kept the 761st training for 2 years instead of the standard few months became their greatest advantage. The extensive training meant that when the battalion finally entered combat, they were possibly the best prepared tank battalion in the US Army. They could perform maintenance in complete darkness, had memorized every aspect of their tank's operation, and had developed a unit cohesion that only comes from extended time together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified that the delay in sending them to combat, which was wrong and racist, accidentally created the best-trained tank battalion in the Army. They could do things with Shermans that shouldn't have been possible, he said. While Reuben Rivers received the most recognition, Warren Creasy's story deserves special attention. Known as Iron Man, Creasy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment. During one engagement, Creasy's tank was knocked out by German fire. Instead of withdrawing, he took control of a .50 caliber machine gun on a half-track and used it to cover his crew's escape while destroying the German position. He would often volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, leading reconnaissance missions on foot behind enemy lines. Creasy survived the war, but like many veterans, struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and it wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that his extraordinary service received proper recognition. One aspect of the battalion's service that surprised German forces was their mechanical proficiency. Nazi propaganda had insisted that black soldiers couldn't operate complex machinery. Instead, the 761st maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in the Third Army. This was partly due to their extended training, but also to the dedication of men like technician 5th grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through the night, often under fire, to keep tanks running. German reports expressed bewilderment at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they thought were destroyed back in action within days. The 761st also developed innovative tactics for dealing with superior German armour. When facing Tigers or Panthers whose frontal armour was nearly impenetrable to Sherman guns, the battalion used bait and flank tactics. One tank would deliberately expose itself to draw German fire while other tanks manoeuvred to flanking positions, targeting the thinner side and rear armour. This required extraordinary coordination and courage. The bait tank was often destroyed. These tactics were studied and adopted by other American armoured units. The battalion's combat innovations contributed to the overall improvement of American armoured doctrine in the European theatre. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 761 played a crucial role in relieving the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. While Patton's relief of Bastogne is well known, the role of the 761 is often overlooked. Fighting through terrible winter conditions with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the battalion helped punch through German lines. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht, but also SS units making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and running low on everything, watched as the 761's Shermans broke through German lines. One paratrooper later recalled that they didn't care what colour they were. "They were the most beautiful sight we'd ever seen," he said. The battalion produced exceptional combat leaders. Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long, and Lieutenant Charles Barber all demonstrated tactical brilliance under fire. These black officers commanded not through formal military hierarchy, but through earned respect and demonstrated competence. Captain David Williams, who commanded Company A, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other company commander in the battalion. Most were downgraded or ignored due to racial prejudice, only being properly recognized decades later. The 761st's success came partly from their exceptional cooperation with infantry units. Despite initial prejudice from white infantry units, the tankers' combat performance quickly earned respect. During the assault on Klimbach, France, white infantrymen specifically requested the 761st's support, having seen their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide close support, often at great risk, saved countless infantry lives. One infantry sergeant wrote home that the coloured tank boys saved our bacon more times than I can count. "They'd drive right into German fire to give us cover," he wrote. "I don't care what anyone says back home, these men are heroes." The battalion's aggressive combat style was reflected in their ammunition consumption. They fired over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This wasn't wasteful shooting, but sustained, accurate fire that reflected their extensive training. German after-action reports frequently noted the accuracy of American tank fire in sectors where the 761st operated. As casualties mounted, the battalion faced a unique problem. The segregated army had limited numbers of trained black tank crew replacements. Many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained, or, being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. This meant that experienced crew members couldn't be rotated out for rest. Exhausted men continued fighting because there was no one to replace them. This contributed to both the extraordinary heroism and the high casualty rate. The presence of the 761st created problems for German propaganda. Soldiers who had faced them couldn't reconcile their experience with official Nazi racial theory. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who had faced black American units. Soldiers were asking, if the racial theory is true, why are we losing to inferior races? This cognitive dissonance contributed to the collapse of fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final months. Before deployment, the 761st had trained in the American South under Jim Crow conditions. Most of the black tankers had to train at installations located in southern states such as Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. In the days before the civil rights advances made in the 1960s, black people were still treated harshly in the South and often considered inferior by white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas, they faced constant racial harassment. Local businesses refused to serve them. Military buses were segregated. The battalion was housed in the worst part of the base near the sewage treatment plant. Yet this adversity forged extraordinary unity. The men of the 761st knew they were fighting two wars, one against the Germans and another against racism. This dual purpose gave them a determination that German forces couldn't understand or overcome. The most famous member of the 761st was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, later known as Jackie Robinson. During the battalion's training, a white bus driver told Robinson to move to the back of the bus. Robinson refused and was arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arresting military policeman. The post commander transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was court-martialed but acquitted on all charges. However, the legal proceedings meant he missed the 761st's deployment to Europe. He was honorably discharged and later went on to break baseball's color barrier. In 2005, a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion was dedicated at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, Texas, where they had trained. The monument consisted of 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a battalion fighter kneeling atop a black granite pedestal engraved with a tank on the front and a panther on the back. The dedication was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and military officials. The keynote speaker noted that the 761st had fought not just for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction. Perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. In the 1990s, American military historians interviewing former Wehrmacht veterans about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these units, German veterans frequently described the black tankers who had fought with particular ferocity and skill. These were men who had no reason to praise their former enemies, yet they consistently identified the 761st as among the best tank units they had faced. One former German tank commander stated simply that they fought like devils. "We couldn't understand why men their own country treated as inferior fought so hard for it," he said. Now I think perhaps that was why. They had something to prove, and they proved it. The human cost of the battalion's service was severe. With nearly 50% casualties, they paid a heavy price for their achievements. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers had died fighting for a country that denied them basic rights. One veteran later said that they knew what they were fighting for was bigger than the prejudice they faced. "We were fighting for what America could be," he said, "not what it was." For decades, the 761st story was largely unknown outside the black community. History books, when they mentioned black soldiers at all, typically focused on support units. The combat achievements of units like the 761st were minimized or ignored. This began to change in the 1970s with the civil rights movement's emphasis on recovering black history. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought national attention. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony brought even more. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units in the European theater. Their story is taught at the U.S. Army Armor School, studied at military academies, and honored in museums. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion remains relevant today. It demonstrates that prejudice and discrimination waste human potential. The Army's initial reluctance to use black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its best tank battalions. It also shows that excellence cannot be suppressed by prejudice. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from their enemies, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion achieved extraordinary things through skill, courage, and determination. Their story challenges us to examine our own prejudices and preconceptions. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be so catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions do we make today that might be equally false? The battalion's combat record became a powerful argument for military integration. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, the combat achievements of units like the 761st were specifically cited as evidence that segregation weakened military effectiveness. During the Korean War, integrated units performed exceptionally well, validating what the battalion had proven, that competence and courage know no racial boundaries. Many veterans of the 761 served as advisors during this integration process, sharing lessons learned from their unique experience. Individual veterans faced varied post-war experiences. Some, like E.g. McConnell, used the GI Bill to get college educations that would have been impossible before the war. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their service. Warren Creasy struggled with PTSD, then called combat fatigue, for years after the war. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about his experiences. It wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that many families learned the full extent of their relatives' heroism. The full story of the battalion has been pieced together from various sources, including official army records, German military archives, personal letters and diaries, and oral histories collected decades later. Each source adds details to the picture of extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. The U.S. Army's official history, published in the 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st. It took independent historians and the veterans themselves to ensure their story was preserved. Today, the National Archives holds extensive records of the battalion's service, available to researchers and the public. The battalion's liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors and their descendants have maintained connections with battalion veterans and their families. In 2015, the Austrian government invited surviving members to ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They were honored not just as liberators, but as men who had shown humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. The German Tigers and Panthers never expected the Black Panthers to fight at all, much less to fight for 183 consecutive days without relief. Nazi racial ideology had assured them that black soldiers were incapable of operating tanks, lacking in courage,